All right, I think I'm going to get us started. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kate, and I am the Education Program Manager here at Sierra Club BC. Today, if you have any questions, we've got a Q&A box, so you can feel free to type in any of your questions there. Drop a message in the chat for where you're tuning in from if you're just joining us now. I'm so excited for today. We're going to be learning so much about sandpipers. I'm going to be also monitoring the chat and bringing it back to our two speakers here today. So I'm so excited to introduce our guest, Kris Cu, who is a digital media and outreach specialist for Birds Canada. In his spare time, he is also a wildlife photographer, birding guide, and nature enthusiast, as are we all. I'm so excited for him to share some of the videos and his experiences with sandpipers today. I'm also so delighted to introduce our returning drawing scientist, Dr. Julius Csotonyi. Julius is a scientific illustrator and natural fine history artist, and he actually has a lot of illustrations of birds that he's done recently that I would love for him to talk about. But as always, I'm so delighted to have both of you with us today to teach us more about the small and the sweet sandpiper. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand it over to Kris to start us off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate, and the entire Sierra Club BC team for arranging and organizing this wonderful event. And I can't wait to learn more about drawing as well from Julius. So I'm very excited. So I'm first going to share a quick video with you, and so you can visually see what it's like to see Western sandpipers out here in British Columbia. So this footage is taken from Brunswick Point in Delta and Ladner. And these are Western sandpipers and dunlin foraging along the mudflats during migration season, and they peak in these large flocks during the end of April. So these sandpipers are working their way as far down south from the coast of Peru all the way to the Arctic to their breeding grounds. And the shorebirds are stopping by this area at Roberts Bank to feed on invertebrates and biofilm, which we'll talk more about later. So this is a slow down footage, but you can see even then it's going so fast. And you can kind of, it's not entirely probing its beak down into the mud. And we'll talk a little bit more later about that. So biofilm is this thin sort of mucus layer substance just on the surface of the mud. And you can't really see it with your naked eye. You have to take samples like this one, and then you have to put under a microscope to see the little organisms that are living there. And so here's some visuals of that now. This is with a scanning electron microscope. Oh, sorry, just a microscope. Yeah. And the sandpipers do perform murmurations where they flock together and they make this really beautiful movements, usually to avoid predators because there are peregrine falcons and other raptors just hanging around, especially during migration season when they know they were gonna the shorebirds are gonna show in numbers, and so there's more opportunity for them to hunt and catch them. And so just touching a little bit on the biofilm and why it's so important. So the biofilm at Roberts Bank contain really specific polyunsaturated fatty acids, and these are basically huge energy boosts to the sandpipers. And when the sandpipers stop by at the mudflats, they're looking to fuel up with this substance. And so here's Western sandpiper that's going to take off after feeding there. And here's a closer look at their bill. And so it wasn't until recently when scientists actually took a closer look at these sandpipers and figured out they're not really putting their bills down into the mud, and when they sample, there's not really a ton of invertebrates on this mud flat. So what's going on here? And so they took a closer look at the bill of, for example, the shorebird that is called a dunlin, and they saw that it's actually quite flexible. So let me just go back there. And you can see this one, it kind of opens up a little bit at the tip there. And then when they took a closer look at the tongue, oh, it's covered in like these little hairs and little bristles, and that, raise more questions like, why are these invertebrates why are these shorebirds who are supposedly just feeding on invertebrates have this bristly tongue? And that's when scientists figured out, oh, they're actually slurping up biofilm on the surface. And they have evolved specifically to feed on biofilm to fuel their migrations. And it's just how fast they fly during around that area. And so the sandpipers would come in these flocks, and then they would probe into the mud or just the surface of the mud, and they're lapping up this biofilm as they're going on. And so you can see this is real time how fast they move here. And how fast they take off as well. Amazing. Okay.
That's spectacular. So that was really neat because I noticed that at the very beginning of the video you had like the big flock of birds. And you see the mixture of the species of sandpipers because there's several in the area, right? And you could see little black-chested or black-bellied dunlins there mixed in with them, right? And with the westerns being the lighter colored ones. It was really neat to see that distinction. You can easily tell them apart that way.
Yeah, for sure.
And the whole biofilm connection actually speaks really deeply to me as well, because I'm a microbiologist by training, and ecologist. So it's like something that I just kind of like get really excited about as well. So it's really nice to see this kind of discoveries being made that, we're learning new things about some of these beings now. We've known about sandpipers for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now we're finding these new kinds of things about them that are so basic. It's not that they're just eating invertebrates, that they're actually using some of these biofilms, these communities of microorganisms at the surface, of which the large part are those Nietzsche diatoms that are producing all of this wonderful, wonderful high energy what are they? Omega-3 long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Long name.
It's a mouthful for the sandpipers too, but fortunately they don't have to pronounce it. So that's wonderful, actually. Yeah, so very, very cool. Very cool. Thank you for sharing that really awesome video. And did you have more to add to it at the same time? I kind of interrupted you there, but I had to kind of say a few excited little bits in there in reaction to the video.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. I'm just gonna share a little bit more about the ecology so that we understand just how important this sort of mudflat area is. So I'll have it right here. So you might know that BC is quite famous for a lot of our wildlife. For example, we've got bears and orcas and salmon, but not everybody talks about the sandpipers and all the birds. So most of the west coast of North America looks like this, sort of rocky, intertidal, pounded by the waves from the Pacific Ocean. And out here in Metro Vancouver, we have the Fraser River. And what makes this one so special is because it's a huge, huge watershed and river that drains, that covers most of the province. And it all drains down to this area. And guess what it brings down? A lot of sediment and mud. And this is really special because it introduces a unique habitat that otherwise is not commonly found along the West Coast. And so at this area, we have estuarine waters, intertidal mudflats, and then floodplains. So we're able to support up to 1.6 million birds annually just in this small Fraser River estuary. And so here's just a figure showcasing the different types of intertidal habitats here. And I just want to focus your attention to Roberts Bank, which is on the lower half of the figure. That's where we're seeing a lot of our shorebirds and sandpipers feeding.
That's that sort of pink slanted sort of square area. There you yeah, okay, yeah, just so that people
right.
Yeah, right. Nice.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about the conditions that make it so favorable to shorebirds later on. But we have two main types of shorebirds that congregate at the end of April, and that is the dunlin and the western sandpiper. And you can't tell this from the photos, but the dunlin are a little bit larger than the western sandpipers. And if you take a closer look at their bills too, it's sort of longer and it droops at the end. And you could say that the bill is maybe twice as long as the head of the dunlin itself. And then if you look at the image of the western sandpiper, you can see it's got a shorter bill. It still has a little bit of droop at the end, but at the bill itself is sort of straight and pointed down. And then the bill is about the length of the head itself. And so I'm gonna pass it over to Julius, and we'll get drawing.
Well, thank you, Kris. That's actually really, really helpful for everybody to see this. And I really like that you had both the videos as well as these nice still pictures of the beings that we're dealing with in this session, as well as their environment. I really like that we're pushing or we're sharing information about that, because we have to remember that all of these beings, and ourselves included, are all members of very complex ecosystems, and that what affects one often affects a lot of other ones as well through cascade reactions. And so we need to protect not just individual species, but we need to think of the bigger picture and protect entire environments, entire ecosystems. That's something that is crucial to remember always. Everything is interconnected biologically. It's one of the things that I love about studying ecology. So, okay, so thank you so much for that excellent sharing. Let's get into the drawing. Oh, by the way, I'd also like to just kind of acknowledge that so I'm not on the West Coast right now. I moved to Edmonton, and I'm currently living on the territory of the Nihehaw, the Niitsitapi, the Métis, the Nakota, the Dene, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. I'm sorry if my pronunciation was off on some of them. And I'm literally right on the edge of the Enoch Cree Nation's lands. And I'm actually very grateful for that, because it is stopping the spread of Edmonton suburbs westward, and that encroaches on forest. I love to see forest, which is actually on their lands right next to me. So very grateful for that. So I've prepared kind of a little rough sketch of what we're going to be doing. I'm going to share my screen here, and then we can get right into the drawing. And then as we draw, Kris and I are going to be talking about the really, really fun aspects of the biology and the ecology and the protection of these amazing beings that we know as, in this case, we selected the, here we go, the Western Sandpiper. So yeah, it was one of the two that Kris had introduced in his videos and the still images. And it is, you noticed in the video as well as in the still images that there was the big difference the biggest difference is visible to me, besides the size, were the length of the bill and the coloration patterns. And the dunlin had this dark belly. The Western Sandpiper does not. So that's the one we're dealing with, is the Western Sandpiper with a slightly shorter bill. This is what it's going to look like when we're finished, roughly. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. Now, I've got actually two versions of this, and this is kind of cool because we know that they have interesting feeding strategies. This is the really cool new information that Kris was talking about. The original version that I had prepared featured the sandpiper pulling a polychaete worm out of the mud. In this case, a bit of an action shot, but you can also kind of have a version in which we have it just kind of like, here we go, extending its bristly tongue as it's about to slurp up some biofilm. And it is such amazing stuff that they've evolved these bristles that are much more effective, higher surface area on their tongue, and that will cause the diatoms, those microscopic organisms that produce those fatty acids that are crucial to their energy to stick to those bristles on their tongue, and they can lap up these much more efficiently. Biology is all about trying to find the most efficient ways to get resources, right? So that you can cut down your costs and increase your benefits so that you can fly farther, get more food. They can lay more eggs, make more baby sandpipers, and spread around the world, which they've done actually pretty well for their size. They number in the millions. But we have to remember too that even though a being has numbers in the millions or billions, like passenger pigeons, it doesn't mean they're necessarily safe from threats. Because as we know from history, probably North America's most abundant bird at the time, the passenger pigeon, was in a few decades driven right to extinction through hunting. So our impacts are enormous. We cannot minimize that, and we have to always be cognizant of our footprint on the biosphere. This is something that I always advocate for. Never assume that something is called common, it means that it's safe, or something that is in the millions is safe. But that's just sort of like a little preface to what I feel is important for us to always be thinking about when we're looking at these wonderful beings. So I'm going to take that rough and make it invisible, and we're going to start with actually drawing it. So we have this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in sections, as we usually do, basically. And we're going to talk about the different parts of the being and how interesting it is that they've evolved different kinds of features to make them succeed so well in their environment, and also about their environment. I think this is going to be a really great opportunity to talk about these intertidal zones. Kris mentioned the intertidal zones. Well, what does the intertidal zone mean? It's the area between the low tide and the high tide if you're on the coast, and therefore it experiences a huge variation in the amount of water covering it. At low tide, there are areas of mud that are fully exposed to the air that at other times get covered by water. And so it's a sort of an amphibious environment. It's partly aquatic and partly terrestrial, depending on the time of day. And that makes it very interesting for the kinds of animals and plants and microbes that live there and that gain access to light and water and nutrients and then the predators and so on. It's a very dynamic ecosystem and very important and very susceptible to damage too. So let's get started on drawing the sandpiper. I'm going to go moving back and forth because I have a sort of a digital drawing tablet here that I'm working on. That's beside me, and the camera's on the laptop, so I'm kind of going to try to be looking at here, but also kind of drawing here. So anyway, the first thing we're going to do is we want to establish kind of where the sandpiper is going to be located on the page, and so we're going to draw the majority of its body, and it's kind of like a raindrop shape sideways, if I can put it that way. So what we're going to do is I will draw here, and all of these are always kind of split it up into stages, and I've always got a little bit of a light silhouette or a little fine line that appears beforehand to kind of guide us along. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this sort of funny little sideways raindrop shape. And here we go. This is the back of the sandpiper. It's kind of neat. When you look at them sideways, they almost look like the cross-section of a airplane wing. Anyway, and that's not accidental either, in the sense that evolution has generated animals and plants that are so well adapted to their environments. This is a flying animal. The cross section of its body is going to be, or has been honed through millions of years of natural selection to be very aerodynamic. And one of the most aerodynamic shapes of an object, like in this case, the body of the animal, is one where you have sort of a little bit more of a rounded front and then a tapered back. And if you look at, like, that's the shape that a raindrop takes when it's falling, for example. It's the one that aerodynamic forces basically mold it into to result in the least, it ends up resulting in the least turbulence around it. And so this reduces the amount of energy that the bird needs to fly. Just really neat to see these kinds of patterns. Anyway, so that's why this is often shaped this way, the cross-section of the body. So there we go. That's the body. We've kind of established where it is. Now the head of this bird is a continuation of that body, but then in this case, we got its head kind of tipped downward. They're fast-moving little birds when they're running along the surface. You saw from Kris's video how they were just like darting all over the mud flat there. It was beautiful. And we're catching this in sort of like a snapshot of it with its head pointing downward. And it's, I'm going to draw this rounded head. And it's pointing downward because it's feeding, doing like a really important part of being on a mud flat. They spend so much of their time getting energy, gaining the nutrients, the food. Some of it is invertebrates, animals without backbones, such as worms or other small crustaceans. But as Kris was saying, they also slurp up this wonderful biofilm material, these algae, diatoms, which are photosynthetic algae that actually make these beautiful glass-like shells called frustules, and inside of them they've got these huge globules of these fatty acids that they produce, which are really, really high in calories, and also tend to be one of the interesting things is that one of the studies was showing that they tend to reduce the creation of what are called reactive oxygen species. So those are these are chemicals that our body sometimes produces in response to certain foods and certain conditions that can cause what's called oxidative damage to our tissues. They can sort of rip up some of the molecules around them. Eating these polyunsaturated fatty acids reduces the production of some of these harmful chemicals. It's a kind of an antioxidant kind of a situation. So they're gaining energy, but they're also helping to reduce the damage to their cells. Really neat how these multifaceted types of functions of some of these chemicals. I love microbiology and various things, and this is actually a whole other area where algae is sort of phycology, when they deal with, and especially the photosynthetic microbes that are eukaryotic, the ones with nuclei. I studied bacteria, so I get excited about all of these, but they are part of a larger ecosystem of microbes, and that's all very, very interesting how they interact. Oh, side note there. I get excited about microbiology. The tail of the sandpiper is just barely visible, sticking out from underneath the wing feathers that are pointed back. It's this little bit at the left end of the animal, this little nub that comes out like this. So the tail feathers and the wing feathers, when the wings are closed, kind of line up and stick out the back of the bird like this. And so they're not in use right now for flight. So they just kind of like retract it, kind of like how an airplane can, extend its flaps or pull them back, but also it can totally move its wings. There are very few airplanes that can move their wings anywhere near as much as birds. So birds are wonderfully evolved for flight and for efficient movement, both in the air and on the ground. So you've got this really nice aerodynamic body. Even when the wings are closed, you can see the shape of it, how it's just really effective that way. And then there's the beak. So Kris was saying how the Dunlin and the Western sandpiper have different shaped beaks somewhat. The Western sandpiper is the one we're dealing with here, and this one has a slightly shorter beak. And both of them have this beak that it's long and narrow, but also slightly drooping at the tip. So you have to keep in mind when you're drawing this that there's a very, very, very slight curvature to the beak. So it's just barely visible. It just kind of tiny bit bends downward. Okay? But it does kind of taper. It gets narrower toward the end like this. Okay? And there's the mouth like this. Incidentally, and this is really, really, really cool, I think. Why do birds have beaks? Why do all birds have beaks? And birds are dinosaurs, by the way, right? They evolved directly from theropod dinosaur ancestors. Why is it that all the remaining dinosaurs have beaks that survived the extinction 66 million years ago? There was an interesting idea proposed a few years ago that among the features that might have helped animals to survive that asteroid impact 66 million years ago was the presence of a beak. When the asteroid struck, it just devastated the world's forests and plant life in general, and therefore animal life as well that fed on it. And so fresh plant life took a long time to start to recover. It took a while because the planet was encased in sort of darkness under dust for a while and ash. But animals that were able to feed on seeds, which are typically longer lasting than leaves, which might shrivel up after a few days of exposure to darkness, were probably more likely to survive because they could rely on these long-lasting food sources. So seed-eating birds might have had an advantage over some of the other dinosaurs that fed on vegetation or meat. So just kind of an interesting thought there. Is a really neat hypothesis to test. Anyway, there's the beak, and the nostril of the bird is right here at the base of the beak. That's actually really cool when you think about it, right? Why would its nostril be right up at the base of the beak, that far back? Kris, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll see this feature with a lot of other shorebirds as well. It's because they're sort of probing their bill into the mud or into sediment or some sort of substrate. And so they still need to be able to breathe when they're doing that and they're feeding along. And so this is why the feature, the nostril is closer to the start of the bill there.
And then you could see that really well in Kris's video of the sandpiper probing for the biofilms. Even though it wasn't sticking its whole beak in, it didn't need to, because the biofilm is composed of photosynthetic algae, and mud is a really good filter that removes sunlight even a few millimeters below the surface. So biofilms have to be the photosynthetic ones that produce these polyunsaturated fatty acids. They have to be at the surface for them to survive and grow. Therefore, the bird doesn't have to stick its beak too deep below, but the biofilm is also beneath a layer of water often. So the bird doesn't have to be there at the lowest tide. It can be there when there's a little bit of water on the surface. And having the nostril at the base of the beak allows it to stick its beak under the surface of the water to access the biofilm and still be able to breathe, as Kris was saying. So just the neatest thing when you look at all of these little bits of anatomy and how they actually work together. This has taken millions of years to evolve, because these are the variants genetically that tended to survive better and reproduce better. And so now we have most animals that have this kind of way of life with beaks and nostrils positioned in such a way that it maximizes their success. It's just the coolest thing. So there we go. If you want to, I will. If you want to, you can add the little tongue sticking out. I don't know if they're able to stick their tongue out much at all, but I would imagine they would a bit, because they want to access some of those biofilms. And I don't know how far they can stick their tongue out. Kris, do you know how far they can stick their tongue out?
It's not super long. It's yeah, they usually don't. It doesn't take much effort for them to slurp up the biofilm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, some birds have really long tongues. You've seen like hummingbirds can stick them way out. And actually, this may or may not be accurate to think about sandpipers sticking their tongues out, because of course they have their beak under the surface as well. It might just be the motion rubbing against the biofilms to bring them up. So I'm not entirely sure. So I'm actually going to leave that out myself, because we may or may not see the tongue, and we wouldn't really see the tongue out anyway, because even if it could stick it out, because it's mostly under the surface at that point. So this is a bird on its way down toward the surface of the sediment to lap up biofilms, or to pick up invertebrates that are also there. More nutrients, a different kind of set of nutrients. So every species of animal that it eats, or the biofilms, has a different composition biochemically, different nutrients. And so the biofilms are great for some things, but they can also get other kinds of proteins, for example, from other animals. And diatoms are not a really good source of protein. So they would need to still be able to eat other invertebrates, which are a much better source of protein. But the biofilms provide this wonderful fatty acid, which helps them in other ways. So they're not, yeah, there's kind of generalists in the kinds of animals they eat. They don't feed on one specific kind of food. They kind of eat a lot of different things that kind of fit within their bills and are found in the same general kind of habitat. Okay, so now the eye, and the eye is situated near the middle of the head. It's kind of like a bit like a little lemon-shaped eye, but big, sort of wide lemon-shaped eye. And they're very dark, so you can actually feel it. And what I like to do as an artist, you want to think about the luster of a surface, right? So if you look at my glasses and they're reflecting the lights above me, any kind of a shiny and often wet surface, like the surface of an eye, which is wet, will reflect any kinds of brilliant lights in the sky, like the sun, right? This is a specular reflection, which means that it basically is image forming the reflection, and it's like a little reflection of the object. And so you can leave a little bright spot in the eye is to kind of represent the reflection of the sun. You can fill in the rest of the eye dark. They have dark eyes. but I'm going to leave that little specular reflection there. I'll zoom in here and actually show you what's going on. And also give you a kind of a fun little tip. If you're drawing eyes and these shiny objects in general. So I'm filling it in fully here, but before you fill it in fully, or maybe you already have, that's okay. You can practice this with other things as well. Something else that's neat to think about is that if you look closely at shiny objects like an eye, you will, depending on how the your how bright it is around you and how much your pupils have closed down, or what kind of camera you're using, you might see a greater or narrower range of reflection brightnesses. And if you're in sort of a darker conditions, not really brilliant, you might actually also see not just the reflection of the sun, the pinpoint, but also reflection of the sky somewhat, because the sky is brighter than the ground typically, but it's not always as visible in these eyes. But if I wanted to represent that, this is kind of neat. I can make it so that it's not just that sunlight that's reflecting. And let's pretend this is low sunlight, right? It's near the horizon. So therefore, I'm going to put the sky reflection in there. I'm erasing away some of this here. Right? So there's a little bit of that brighter area on part of the eye that's reflecting the sky, but also the pinpoint of the sun. So you can play around with this and look at photographs of reflective objects like eyes, and you can make them much more interesting and realistic looking if you incorporate the kinds of things that they are reflecting and think about how well they reflect those. Just kind of interesting little bits. And I love to play around with reflections and lighting as an artist. It's super fun. Okay, so that's the eye. Next, we're going to move on to the legs, because this is what sandpipers use so well to get around and dart around all over the mud flats. And so these are dinosaurs, and they're bipedal dinosaurs, as pretty much all theropods were mostly bipedal. Some may have used their arms a little bit here and there, but that's rare. And birds, the surviving dinosaurs, use their arms for flying, right? So we don't actually see the arms of these sandpipers separately as we would for theropods like Allosaurus or Tyrannosaurus or Dromaeosaurus. They're sort of evolutionary cousins. And but we do see their legs, and their legs look very much like your typical dinosaur legs in some ways. What you see, and so we're going to draw the left leg first of the sandpiper. What we see is there's a bend here, and it looks like an elbow. It's not an elbow. So what we see here, this bend actually is the ankle. Okay? So birds walk on their toes, and it's like the ball of their foot, and their ankle is up high, and that's the point that bends a lot. And their knees actually are hidden in the feathers. And if you ever eaten a chicken drumstick, this would be the drumstick part here, and then the chicken thigh. The knee is right in between the two, right? So that's hidden within the feathers of this bird, because they have so much feather material that if you looked at a bird without the feathers, the sandpiper would look really skinny and would look kind of ridiculous without its feathers. The outline of the bird is really defined very heavily by its feathers. And so we just have to keep in mind that we're missing some key elements of their anatomy that we just can't see, but they're still there. Okay? So the parts of the leg that we see are the lower part of the drumstick, that shin, and then of course the ankle, and down here is what would be the foot bones. For our feet, the long part of our foot, that's what those bones are. Those are the metatarsals. Okay, and so that's what we're looking at here. And then of course, if you look at the foot of the left foot of this bird here has 3 toes pointing forward. I'm going to make these little toes, and they have little claws at the end. Very small, thin toes. Like that. There's the third one. And there's a little toe and a claw pointing backward, and this is the halix. That one's not really as big as the other ones. It's really most of the front 3 that are used mostly for walking. Now, the halix is really important for perching birds. Can you tell us anything about it? I mean, this is not sandpiper related, but Kris, you probably know a lot more about the importance of the halyx in other bird species, as I meanwhile draw the right leg of the bird.
Yeah, so in a lot of other bird species, as Julius was mentioning, in forest birds especially, it's really important that they have that feature so that they can grip onto the branches and stems of trees. And in some other species, like woodpeckers, which are sort of perching vertical onto the trunks of trees, they actually have an extra stiffened tail to help them stabilize onto the tree as they're sort of moving up and down and hiking along the trunk of the tree. And yeah, very very cool adaptation by different bird species.
Isn't it really? And if I'm not mistaken, am I correct? I think woodpeckers are weird also. Good that you brought them up, because I think they have 2 toes forward and 2 backward, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's neat, because as you said, they stick to trees. So you want a really good sort of like a clamp to the surface of the rough bark, and having 2 toes pointing backward is great, because that way they can just stabilize themselves even better. Just the coolest thing. And then some birds also have this feature, don't they, where like the perching birds, they have a feature of it's their tendons or ligaments that sort of lock the foot around the branch when they're sitting on it, so that when they're asleep, they don't just fall off.
That's right. Yeah, it's sort of like an automatic clamp for them, instead of putting so much similar to, it's not like when we grab a cup, we have to contract our fingers to hold on to the cup. It's the opposite for birds, right? It's an automatic thing that when they perch on a branch like that, oh, it's secure. They're not gonna just forget, like, oh, whoops, and they fall off the tree.
Exactly. It doesn't require as much energy, therefore, to be standing on a branch that way. Like for me, if I'm holding my mug, if I were to fall asleep, and I've done this before, I've dropped the mug while I'm like so sleepy while working sometimes that I actually fall asleep. That happens. But it's not going to happen for a bird sitting on a branch. They'll just remain standing there, because the automatic, natural, low energy situations for them to be clamping the branch, it's because of the way that some of these tendons, when they're under pressure, will contract and hold the bird in place. So this is the coolest thing. So it requires energy for them to actually release it, which is kind of unusual. Very different from us. So anyway, yeah, that's perching birds, but they evolved from a common ancestor. And you can see that in sandpipers, that hind pointing toe is much less developed. It's smaller. They don't need it as much because they're not perching. It's mostly those 3 front toes that they use for walking. And what you see here is I've put the right leg in place. This is a bird where the right leg is kind of coming off the ground. It's sort of walking, and it's walking toward the next place where it's going to get a meal. So it's got its leg lifted. That's why it looks kind of funny like this. And if I put the foot in place, you'll see that in this situation, as the foot is raised, those toes, they kind of actually do this kind of funny little recurved kind of thing, kind of like I can do with my fingers. I have this hypermobility thing where I can kind of bend them backward. And birds' feet also kind of do this. It helps them to raise their toes off the ground as they walk forward. Again, minimizing how high they have to lift their legs. Their toes clear the ground better. Again, it's all about minimizing the amount of energy needed for any activity, including walking. If you can do it more effectively by not putting as much effort into raising your leg higher, but just bending your toes a little bit, it just saves you a little bit of energy. It's all about efficiency. It's the coolest thing. So here are the 3 toes pointing forward. You can see 2 of them really well. There's a third one that is mostly obscured by the middle toe, but you can only see a little bit of the claw kind of sticking out. And then the backward pointing toe again is here with a little bit of the claw on it as well. So that leg is lifted up, and it's doing that so it can walk forward the next stride. And in the meantime, it's scanning for these biofilms or invertebrates, whatever it comes across. And so it's hunting actively. So, and is it a carnivore or is it a herbivore or what? And it's interesting because some of the time it's a carnivore. When it's eating invertebrates, it's hunting animals, right? But when it's eating biofilms, that's no longer feeding on animals in the same way. It's more of a herbivore. It's not feeding on plants, but it's feeding on photosynthetic microorganisms. So it's still kind of a herbivore. It's kind of an interesting in-between situation sort of thing there, because we don't often have too many animals that actively feed on microorganisms, biofilms. Most of them feed on either flesh of other animals or plants. But it's important to remember, and The photosynthetic microbiologist will point this out, that there are other photosynthetic creatures than just plants. The world is full of them. And if you take a swim, if you're lucky enough to be able to scuba dive or snorkel in the West Coast there, and if you're lucky enough to encounter kelp, you'll know that some photosynthetic beings that are not plants can grow to very large size. Kelp are not plants, but they are photosynthetic beings that live in the water. Really fascinating, neat stuff. They're huge, multicellular, evolved multicellularity completely independently to plants. That always blows me away. Okay, there we go, another little side note. But we've got the feet now in place. Now we're going to put in some of the last details of this being that lives on these tidal flats. The feathers. Okay, so these sandpipers have different sets of feathers that are visible on them. The ones on their belly are so smooth, you can't individually make out the feathers, right? But their wing feathers and the covert feathers on their wings have beautiful patterns on them that allow us to see them individually on the back of the sides of the bird. And so, for example, there's a set of feathers that are just visible underneath most of the feathers. These are called the primaries. And as I draw these, Kris, can you talk about the primaries? And they're wing feathers, right? So
Yeah, so these birds are really specialized for migrating really long distances. And if you've ever had the pleasure of watching them feeding, you can see that they're able to take off just so quickly, and they just seem to glide and cover so much distance for a bird that small. They weigh about as much as 5 grapes, and they travel from Peru, where they spend the non-breeding season during the winter here in North America, and they fly north all the way to the Arctic to breed. And then they do the same journey after the breeding season. And so these are really incredible, super-powered birds, even though they are tiny and they don't weigh very much. And yeah, just incredible.
it's actually one of the longest flights of some birds. I know there are ones that fly longer than that, some that go from the Arctic to the Antarctic every year and back. But I mean, from Peru to the very north edge of North America is amazing, because in BC we don't actually have them. These don't breed in BC, right? They breed in Western Alaska, right? And so what we see are actually, I think it's the winter plumage mostly, right?
So
Or
in April, you are able to see them in full breeding plumage, which is incredible. That's when they get the rusty sort of cap and the rufous coloring. But when they're coming back down south from the Arctic, that's when you get them in the non-breeding plumage. So they're more of like a toned down, light gray color as they're coming down. Mhm.
Actually, that's an interesting thing to note too, because a lot of the birds that we have in Canada, we see in breeding plumage, because Canada is pretty far north as a lot of ranges of animals go. And so the birds that we see typically are in breeding plumage. They're here to nest, and then a lot of them travel, the migrating ones, they migrate south to their wintering grounds where they don't have their breeding plumage. So we often don't see a lot of our songbirds in non-breeding plumage. What's really neat is that, as Kris points out, for the Western sandpiper, we see both types of plumage. In the beginning of the year, in spring, we see them in their breeding plumage, but we also see them on their way back south after breeding is complete in their, more drab kind of coats. So that's kind of unusual as migratory birds in Canada go. There aren't a lot of cases like that. So the primaries there, as I've just drawn these lines, are a series of feathers that are the longest feathers at the very end of the wing. Those are super important for flight. These are their flight feathers, the main flight feathers. They're what give birds the ability to take off from the ground and have this powered flight. There are also secondary feathers that are, so the primaries are basically attached to their fingers, because these are dinosaurs. They had fingers and they have fingers, but you can't see the fingers easily when you're looking at the wings of a bird, except that the primary feathers are the ones that come off their fingers, basically. The secondary feathers come off more their forearm area. Those ones are not so very visible when they're on the ground, except they are kind of visible. They do cover the primaries because they kind of fold over top of them when the wings are folded in. But then you have a series of other feathers, coverts, that that go over top of even those ones, and they kind of protect them when they're on the ground. And that's what we see a lot of the color in for some of the back of the sandpiper. So we're going to add some of these secondaries and coverts, and it's kind of a mishmash of beautifully patterned feathers on the back of the bird. And what we do is we draw these sort of longish kinds of loopy lines here. I want to point something out to you here as I'm doing this. Notice that I'm drawing them overlapping in a very specific way. And this is crucially important for flight. If I were to draw the wings of a bird, I'm going to do this to the side. You don't have to do this. An outstretched wing of a bird, a generalized wing. It looks sort of like this. Okay. And then where it attaches to the body. There's the body. Okay. This is looking from above. When you look at the wing of a bird, you will see these primary feathers. These are the long ones at the end. And if you look, this here is kind of like our upper arm. This part is the forearm. And then here, you can't really see where they end, but there are fingers of the bird, like finger bones. And these feathers, these primary feathers, come off the fingers. Okay, like that. You can see where they start. It's around this region. Then the secondaries come off the forearm. But as I'm drawing it, something to pay attention to is how they overlap. If I were to draw these feathers in detail, I would have to make sure that when you look at it from above, and this is important if you're drawing any birds, especially flying birds, you draw that the leading edge of the feathers, when viewed from above, when the wing is viewed from above, are the part that are visible, not the tail end of the feathers. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense aerodynamically. If you have air, like it's trying to basically push down on the atmosphere as it flies, right? And when it does so, and it's pushing forward as well, if the feathers are overlapping in such a way that the leading edge is on top, that means that the air pushes upward against the back of the feathers, and that causes the feathers to push against each other and not to separate and allow air to move through them, as would be the case if the feathers were overlapped in the other way, where it would be the tail edge that comes out and is sticking out. So it's beautifully evolved to catch air and hold it and the wing remain intact as a single sheet rather than separate out like the units of blinds on a window. It's beautiful when you look at it that way, but it's important to draw this correctly so that when you draw the overlap of feathers, you draw it so that the front edge is showing not the back edge when viewed from above. And because the bird's wings are folded up on its sides, we're looking at the top edge of the wing that's folded up. So just a really cool little thing. And you see that sometimes artists make this error, sometimes if they're not paying attention to the anatomy of the birds. But this is something that you can now avoid because you've learned the proper way to draw feathers on a bird. And then there's a whole series of these secondaries and covert feathers. And covert is like it covers, right? It kind of comes in from the base of the word. It's the feathers that cover the rest of the wing, the upper parts, and that when the wing is folded in, that covers some of the flight feathers. And it's really great because it does protect them against wear and tear a little bit while the bird is not flying. And so we see a whole, it's kind of like like shingles on a roof, really. So why might this be, Kris, why might it be effective for birds' feathers, especially when they're on the ground, to have these sort of shingle-like arrangement of feathers?
Yeah, so this arrangement also protects them from the weather and the sun, especially. So the feathers themselves are quite delicate, and obviously they're very important for flight. And so overlapping them like this minimizes the damage to each single feather as they're more protected.
And that's great, right? Because when they're not using them, the main purpose of these feathers, well, there's a couple of purposes, right? There's insulation because they're warm-blooded. There's less energy required to generate heat in their body if they can hold on to more of that heat instead of just escaping. And feathers are really great insulators, as anybody with a downfield parka will tell you. So that's one thing, and that's actually probably the main reason feathers first evolved, is for insulation. And another thing is for visual display. They're colorful. They can show off beautiful colors in their plumage. And anybody seeing birds in their breeding plumage, as we're talking about now, will say, yes, they're incredibly beautifully colored. And of course, for flying birds, and flight evolved later on in birds and their ancestors, it also functions to help them to move through the air without touching the ground. And so if you need to protect them for their primary use when we're talking about those feathers that are on the wing. And so these coverts help to protect them, and the way that they're organized allows water to run off, other things to run off, as Kris was saying, against solar radiation from the sun and so on. Anything that, or sand might hit them, as a wind blowing and so on, all kinds of things. Any impacts of objects that might hit them, flying branches during storms, anything that it can absorb some of that impact and protect the really crucial flight feathers that if they were damaged or cut off, the bird would no longer be able to fly, and that could really cause it to die. But the nice thing is that they also molt and can replace feathers. So losing their feathers isn't necessarily the end of the world if it's done in the proper order. Not all at once, maybe, because they do this naturally to repair, to replace damaged feathers. They grow new sets every year, and so you get molting happening as well. If you find feathers on the ground, you can tell that birds are molting. And you can often find beautiful feathers hanging around. So there's most of the shape of the bird. Now we're going to draw in some markings, because Western sandpipers have certain markings. And for that, they have a few different kinds of markings. The head has this really neat kind of little streak. And I'm going to put this in a different sort of layer myself, but there's a little streak of color that connects the eye to the beak. So a little bit of a line there. And then there's also a little bit of a dark line coming off the back behind the eye, kind of diffuse. And then there's a bit of a reddish and darker kind of a cap on the head. And it's not like really solid color. It's made up of a whole bunch of little darker little striations and so on as well. So it's not really a clean, solid color that we're drawing in here, basically. And then, of course, if you had the time, we could also draw in the color on the individual feathers. But keep in mind that the individual feathers have this beautiful sort of white edge, like the flight feathers and the covert feathers on the back have this beautiful white edge on, and the middles are kind of dark more. And then also there's a streak of them around here, this zone that happens to be more rufous colored, reddish colored in breeding plumage, as Kris was describing. And also a few little flecks of color streaks, or flecks arranged in kind of lines or patches and zones sort of near the throat of the bird as well. But the belly is mostly white in adults, and juveniles, of course, will have different plumage colors as well, right? And Kris, do they show sexual dimorphism where the male and female are different in color, or how does that work with Western sandpipers?
It's not very clear. You have to have the birds in hand, and even then, the length of the bill on the female might be longer, but it's hard to identify male versus females just visually like that.
So one thing I'd like to ask here, I'll point out one thing and launch us into this last bit that I think it would be important for us to cover. Climate change that we're seeing accelerating on our world is having many different effects. One of them is that it is likely to interfere with the development of some of these communities, including biofilms in some of these intertidal zones. Warming conditions can do that. So that can affect the ability of these birds to access some of their nutrients. What are some of the threats that sandpipers, and I know there's several species, might face, and how many of those are we potentially responsible and can make changes to? What would your input on that be?
So I would say the biggest threat to sandpipers and long distance migratory shorebirds are the loss of habitat, either breeding habitat or stopover habitat. And because these birds are flying such great distances and they have specific places they need to stop and refuel, if we don't protect those sites, it's kind of like removing steps on a ladder, right? If you're thinking about going up to the top and you start removing the steps, then you're not gonna make it all the way to the top. And research has shown that with loss of habitat, some birds still do make it, but when they get to the breeding ground, they're either too exhausted to reproduce successfully, or they're just too, yeah, the quality is not the same because yeah, they're not able to refuel as much as if the habitat was there. And so those are the main things that are of concern as we go on forward and we developed our shorelines and things like that. Yeah.
And of course, if they can't reproduce effectively, if they produce fewer young or not as healthy young, then of course their numbers don't either. Usually they're not growing. Usually they're steady, and if they're not maintaining that, their numbers start to drop, and that's the problem. And locally, especially, are there? And actually, if you'd like to share any additional material, let me know. I can definitely unshare this, and then I can show you the final product afterwards, if you'd prefer, and if you have any useful information about local kinds of issues, for example, with conservation of these
Yeah,
habitats.
absolutely. I can just quickly share a little bit more about our local sandpipers here.
And then Kris can share relevant material there.
So some of you might be wondering, oopsies, why are the sandpipers showing in so many numbers during April? And the secret to that is when the spring comes, there's a lot of fresh water and snow melting that goes down through the Fraser River. And when it reaches the intertidal habitat around Roberts Bank, it washes over the mudflats, and that actually stresses the biofilm to start producing these polyunsaturated fatty acids. So it's a very specific condition when there's a large volume of fresh water washing over the mudflat that the diatoms start producing these fatty acids, and then the sandpipers come, and it's this amazing timing that's evolved over time, and they just know it. At the end of April, that's when they usually get that huge influx of energy from the biofilm. And so one of the main threats happening right now is the development of the Roberts Bank 2 terminal. And what they're proposing to do is to create another terminal that extends from what is currently there. And the problem there is that it's going to disrupt even more of that mixing of fresh water and salt water that will make those biofilm produce the fatty acids. And so that essentially means less food, right? So if you look at this image, you can see the terminal sticking there, and you can see that it's not mixing a ton of water. The sediment is all up on the northern side, right? And then the southern side is still a darkish bluish color, right? And the sandpipers are feeding on the northern side. They're not feeding on the southern side. And you can see visually why that sort of happened, because there's not mixing of the water. And so as the second terminal is going to get built, that is going to disrupt even more habitat for the Western sandpiper. And that is sort of our main concern moving forward, that they're going to lose this important and critical stopover site.
And that's actually a really important point there, is that a lot of people look at this and say, okay, well, it's just a little extension of this terminal. Like, it's not a large area. It's just it's a parking lot and things like that. How can that be so significant? But the point is the context. As you pointed out with that map, it's at a very important location and removes a large proportion of that productive habitat, which is small. It's the location and how important it is to removing that very important bit of habitat that feeds so many, many birds. It's location, location, location.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we always have images of old growth rainforests and these visually stunning landscapes that, okay, I can vouch to protect this because it's so beautiful and it's so grand. But it's not as obvious if you look at a mud flat and you're like, oh, okay, that's kind of stinky, it's just flat and it's ugly. So it's hard to advocate for protection of these intertidal zones. But for the Western sandpipers and other shorebirds, it's critical. There's nowhere else that they can sort of stop. If they don't stop here, they're going straight to Alaska.
And as Maya pointed out just in the chat there, I'd like to call attention to people as well verbally, that if you want to take action to protect these wonderful beings, you can send a letter to the BC government calling them to finalize the provincial law that would prioritize biodiversity and ecosystem health. And there's a link there for that through Sierra Club BC. It's the call for a provincial law to protect biodiversity and ecosystems. And I would encourage everybody, please do that and share it with others, because it's this kind of getting together of the public to speak to the government that makes a difference. Send a letter. If you want, I've always advocated for, you could also like include a drawing of sandpipers that you've created in your letter, either digitally or in physical form. Maybe gets their attention even more. We need to tell our government what's important. And oh, there we go. And Kate is holding up her drawing. I think we can send them into Sierra Club and have them appear on a gallery if you're interested. We've often done that. And please do whatever you can. Contact the government, contact your MLAs and your MPs, and tell them about what's important, because we're the only ones that are going to do that. We know there's a lot of lobbying by larger industry to use these lands for other purposes. We have to push back, because we're the ones who are actually standing there to protect them. And it's hard these days as an ecologist and as somebody who cares about the world, the natural world, to see what's happening. And I would hope that we can do as much as we can proactively to try to protect. And there's so many things we can do, you know? So be inspired, never give up, never surrender, never believe when people say, oh, it's too late, you can't do anything anymore. We most certainly can.
Thank you so much for that, Julius. And thank you, Kris, for being with us here today. And a big thank you for everyone else who joined. It makes my heart so warm to see so many people wanting to draw these small, special, strong birds. Yeah, please send us your drawings. We would love to see them. Our next Learn to Draw is November 5th, and it's going to be all about snakes. So if anyone's interested in snakes, I recommend tuning into that. But thank you all so much for coming. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Thank you and goodbye.
Final version of it. There's added some.
Ta-da!
Sandpiper. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Kate and Maya, for organizing this. Thank you, Kris, for sharing all that wonderful information. It was a blast working with you on this. And yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you as well. It's been fun.